Hi everyone, this is Daryl and welcome back to Book Odyssey. In this video I'll be looking at galactic empires in science fiction literature and getting under the skin of this popular trope. The stars like dust encircle me, in living mists of light, and all of space I seem to see in one vast burst of sight. Galactic empires are a pretty common trope used in many subgenres of science fiction, but are particularly common in the space opera. Star Wars and Dune are probably among the most well-known, but the trope permeates sci-fi writing wherever you look, because there's so much potential to develop a great story. Galaxy-spanning empires are often used as the backdrop for writers to explore any number of concepts and ideas, but there's also the opportunity to explore the growth and/or decline of the empire itself. The idea of an empire that spans an entire galaxy, or even just multiple occupied worlds, is a great starting point to explore ideas related to human history, culture, power, the dynamics of change in society, and identity, with ripe opportunities to touch on concepts that deal with technological advancements, future history, alien civilizations, terraforming and ecology, just to name a few. For example, often we see galactic empires as having a core world or a base that rules the human civilization from a single point. There's often an imperial or feudalistic approach to maintaining order across the many worlds. There are often technological advances like faster than light or subspace warp drives to enable communication or travel across the immense distances between worlds. And often there'll be some kind of ruling figure, an emperor or a president that sits in the commanding seat of power. It's easy to imagine the countless stories that can arise from any of these elements, and many writers have employed these in this beloved trope, including myself in my latest book DELPHINE Descends, where the tyrannical Imperial Network treats its world-spanning people as commodities. Perhaps one of the earliest and well-known examples of the Galactic Empire in sci-fi literature is Isaac Asimov's Foundation series, which takes place in the far distant future when humanity has expanded to occupy countless planets. In the Foundation universe, humanity was able to create this empire thanks to the invention of the hyperspatial drive, and concerns itself particularly with the current empire's decline. When looking at Frank Herbert's Dune series, the Duneverse involves a galaxy-spanning empire that is dependent on a single resource, the spice melange, which is the key to space travel and linked to the unique ecology of the planet Arrakis. Using the spice, the navigators of the Spacing Guild are able to steer spaceships that use fold space technology to travel from one point in space-time to another without actually moving. And then we have the Star Wars franchise, which is arguably the most well-known iteration of the Galactic Empire trope on the face of the planet. In this story, the Galactic Empire is a brutal dictatorship. Star Wars is important because it touches on a sub-trope of the Galactic Empire, which has since become popular for a number of reasons. This is the sub-trope of the evil empire, but that's something we will take a look at a little bit later. Before we delve more into the history of the Galactic Empire in sci-fi literature, let's take a brief glimpse at our own history, which is rife with expanding empires that ultimately rose, declined, and then fell. Some of these were used to form the basis of how a galactic empire might function across space. In the 4th century, Alexander the Great conquered an empire that extended from Macedonia to India and measured over 5.2 million square kilometers. However, it broke apart just 22 years after his death and was overtaken by his successor states. The Roman Empire suffered a similar fate. At its height, it extended from the British Isles to Asia Minor and encompassed a landmass of 5 million square kilometers. Yet less than 3 centuries later, it began to split apart and decline. The Mongolian Empire was even larger, stretching from East Asia to Eastern Europe and measuring 24 million square kilometers at its height. But it endured for less than a century before it too broke into a number of successor states. The British Empire, the largest in history, occupied 35.5 million square kilometers. While the end of the empire didn't officially occur until the repatriation of Hong Kong in 1997, the general consensus among historians is that imperial rule ended shortly after the Second World War. The fall of empire, gentlemen, is a massive thing, however, and not easily fought. It is dictated by a rising bureaucracy, a receding initiative, a freezing of caste, a damming of curiosity, 100 other factors. It has been going on, as I have said, for centuries, and it is too majestic and massive a movement to stop. As I've already mentioned, much of the credit of the establishment of the Galactic Empire trope is attributed to Isaac Asimov, whose Foundation series, which first began in the 1940s, is often considered to be the most influential. It is, however, possible to trace the idea back to as long ago as the 1900s, when author Robert W. Cole imagined the British Empire expanding its dominion out into space in his novel The Struggle for Empire. Confederations with worlds within the solar system were common in pulp sci-fi from its inception, and these were extended into the galaxy in such novels as Galactic Patrol, first published in 1937 by E.E. Smith. Asimov, however, was arguably the first to look at the Galactic Empire as itself the subject of the story and the setting, using works such as The History of the Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire as inspiration. Books in the 1940s that then went on to reinforce the popularity of the Galactic Empire as a useful and inexhaustible trope include Judgment Night, The Star Kings, and Recruiting Station. In the 1950s, hard sci-fi writer Paul Anderson began The Technic History, a space opera setting that featured in many of his short stories and novels up until the 1980s. It spans many centuries of future history, but most of the stories are set in one of two periods, the Terran Empire and the Polesotechnic League. It's from the Technic History that Anderson coined the term the Long Night to denote the Galactic Empire dark ages expected after the fall of the Terran Galactic Empire, already stalling from decadence. Then in his Dominic Flandry series, the declining empire is depicted as being so vast it's beyond the regular human's ability to comprehend, and is in the process of collapsing under its own weight, which echoes Asimov's Galactic Empire decline, which has become stagnant and bureaucratic. Galactic empires are in many cases consciously modelled on historical earth-bound empires such as those mentioned before. Asimov stated explicitly that the Galactic Empire depicted in the Foundation series is modelled on the Roman Empire, taking direct inspiration from the historical writings of Edward Gibbon, even to the point of reportedly basing some individual characters on historical figures. It's thought that in Asimov's Galactic Empire series, specifically Pebble in the Sky, in which Earth has become a poor and backward province of the Galactic Empire, this is shaped from Roman-ruled Judea in the 1st century AD. In this story, Asimov's Earth is divided between those who accept the imperial authority and the fanatics who hatch violent plots to bloody rebellion and are the book's clear villains. Similarly, Anderson's Dominic Flandry series likens its own imperial organisation with the Roman Empire. And Dune uses for its inspiration the Holy Roman Empire, as well as the Byzantine and Islamic empires. The empire, the world, one and the same, and if they were not yet so, make them so, for this is the right and correct will of the stars. Modern sci-fi literature continues to use the trope of the Galactic Empire, but it tends to often focus less on the decline of societal order and more on the expansionist elements, drawing on the themes brought out through the negative connotations associated with colonialism to explore issues such as identity, slavery, fascism, and imperialism. These stories very often fall on the verge of dystopia. It's interesting to note the difference in how galactic empires are portrayed in much of modern sci-fi compared to classic sci-fi. In Asimov's Pebble in the Sky, the villains are the rebels, contrasting greatly from the romanticised portrayal of the resistance in much of today's science fiction. Books such as A Memory Called Empire, the Interdependency series, and Ancillary Justice all deal with these themes in one form or another, yet they continue to rely on the fundamental Galactic Empire setting first established by Asimov's Foundation. The Red Rising series takes a more literal approach to looking to the past for inspiration, by drawing on the Roman Empire and combining it with a brutally fascist class system. In Dan Simmons' Hyperion Cantos, the story's version of the Galactic Empire, called the Hegemony, is observed as it's on the brink of falling and takes the story through the power vacuum this then creates. Again, a major theme in the Hegemony is that of stagnation. Then in Stephen Baxter's Xeelee series, roughly 1 million years are spent in a war between galactic humanity and an enigmatic species called the Xeelee. so the focus is on an external enemy rather than anything internal. The Culture series by Ian M. Banks, however, takes a different approach to the Galactic Empire. Where traditionally we often see the Galactic Empire as being an imitation of the traditional human empire in terms of structure, etc., set on a galactic scale. The organisation known as the Culture is composed of sentient beings of the humanoid alien variety, artificially sentient machines, and other sentient alien life forms. Machine intelligences range from human equivalent drones to hyper-intelligent minds. Artificial intelligences with capabilities measured as a fraction of human intelligence also perform menial tasks. Without scarcity, the Culture has no need for money. Instead, its minds voluntarily indulge human and drone citizens' pleasures, leading to a largely hedonistic society. Many of the series' protagonists are humanoids who choose to work for the Culture's elite diplomatic espionage organisations and interact with other civilizations whose citizens hold worldly different ideologies, morals and technologies. But this is where it gets a little bit murky, because a number of these examples bring up the question, is it a galactic empire if you're invited to join rather than colonised, or does this make it a Federation type organisation, and exactly what is the difference? If there is one ideal that the Federation holds most dear, it is that all men, all races can be united. A federation is a relatively loose conglomeration of states with common goals and purposes, coordinated by a central government that's independent from them all, and from which they have a certain amount of autonomy. The Federation in sci-fi is often composed of many different planets, worlds and races, and is inspired by Federation-type powers such as the United States, the United Nations, the European Union and the Commonwealth. One of the most popular federations in sci-fi today can be seen in Star Trek's United Federation of Planets. One of the main differences between how federations and empires are depicted usually involve worlds being given the option of joining a federation, while empires do not ask permission to annex a world. The Federation is sometimes depicted as being the democratic, good counterpart to the imperialist empire, especially as many empires in modern sci-fi are depicted as planet-eating, identity-stripping, culture-squashing entities. The Federation trope generally strives for the common good of all worlds and is rarely evil, but they sometimes suffer from red tape and corrupt politicians. Sometimes, however, federations are evil, but this doesn't necessarily make them empires. When federations are evil, they will oppose independence of colonies or member worlds, and are willing to do just about anything to expand their own control and power over them. One of my personal favourite depictions of an evil federation can be found in the BBC classic, yet surprisingly gritty sci-fi, Blake 7, which began airing in the 1970s. A good example of a federation can be found in Ursula Le Guin's Hainish cycle, with the interstellar entity known as the League of All Worlds and later the Ecumen. In Le Guin's universe, technology makes instantaneous interstellar communications possible, and the ability to send instantaneous unmanned ships carrying bombs to other planets is exploited as well. However, living beings can't survive such travel, and thus humans are limited to space exploration at relativistic speeds. Author Orson Scott Card's Starways Congress, an interstellar government featured in the follow-up to Ender's Game, Speaker for the Dead, similarly relies on faster-than-light travel communications, yet it is more authoritarian and less benevolent than in Le Guin's Ecumen. The Ecumen will wait till you open it, sir. It will force nothing on you. I was sent alone, and I will remain here alone, in order to make it impossible for you to fear me. So, now we've clarified what exactly a federation is and how it differs from a galactic empire, let's take a deeper look at the rise of the evil empire. As I mentioned earlier, probably the best known galactic empire to most will be from Star Wars, which is a military dictatorship founded on fear and terror. The Empire is an explicitly villainous force, with many linking linguistics and visual traits as being directly reminiscent of Nazi Germany. I believe an element of association has meant, amid other contributing factors, which I'll go into shortly, has aided in giving rise to the trope of the evil empire. And subsequently, if there's an evil empire traipsing around the galaxy, chances are there will also be some kind of resistance movement within its borders, and small autonomous worlds that may even band together to become an alliance against the evil empire. The Raj in the Imperial Raj trilogy by Anne Leckie, published between 2013 and 15, is such an empire. The Raj Empire exists within an impenetrable Dyson sphere at the centre of the universe, a barrier which no one has breached in living memory. It expands by annexing entire worlds by force, swallowing up the unique people and cultures whole and forcing them to become, quote, civilized. The empire has been ruled for 2 millennia by Ananda Myanei, a single human consciousness existing endlessly across thousands of cloned bodies. While this is an intriguing concept, it's just one of a number of modern science fiction that chooses to depict empires in this way. The same can be said of a memory called Empire, published in 2019, where the text Kalani Empire employs an expansionist regime. Author Kathreen Martin draws on elements of identity and imperialism, as well as politics, to deal with the protagonist's concerns of her home being annexed. Perhaps the rise of the evil empire is a comment on colonialism in a post-colonialist age, a topic that has always been prevalent in science fiction. On colonialism in sci-fi, John Reeder, in his book Colonialism and the Emergence of Science Fiction, says, "No informed reader can doubt that allusions to colonial history and situations are ubiquitous features of early science fiction motifs and plots." While this concerns itself specifically with early sci-fi, there has been a rise in a specific subgenre of sci-fi that has been termed decolonial sci-fi, which, according to globalsocialtheory.org, involves sci-fi writers from former or current colonialized territories, often reclaiming mythologies and indigenous history appropriated by colonial and imperial anthropology and incorporating modern narratives of oppression. This could go some way to explaining the current popularity in depicting galactic empires through an authoritarian dystopian lens, rather than the more optimistic view of the Galactic Empire seen more in early works of science fiction. Luxury always comes at someone else's expense. One of the many advantages of civilization is that one doesn't generally have to see that, if one doesn't wish. You're free to enjoy its benefits without troubling your conscience. Whatever way you look at the Galactic Empire, it's a trope that I believe will continue to feature in sci-fi for as long as there is sci-fi, and for good reason. It's the type of concept that gets us really thinking about what society could be like when we eventually begin colonizing other worlds. And as we spread even further and the distance between colonists grow, how will we begin to view and treat one another? And how will we find a common thread that links us all? So that's it for this video. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you found it as interesting as I do. Don't forget to hit the like button to support the video. And if you want to see more videos from me, also don't forget to subscribe. Until next time guys, happy reading. Let's take a deeper look. Let's take a deeper look. Do you even speak English?